So Tom was one of the co-investigators on PARAMEDIC2, and as you know, this is again an absolute landmark trial. This is one of the most important questions in cardiac arrest management, and it's a question that has been attempted to be answered by various groups. Historically, all of those attempts to run trials, answer the question, have been unsuccessful until PARAMEDIC2. So it's a real pleasure to welcome Tom to the stage to tell us all about the adrenaline trial. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, and I've said hello to everybody already, haven't I? So I'm going to talk about the PARAMEDIC2 trial, and I'm representing a big group of trialists, and you'll see some of the names throughout this presentation. Copies of the paper, which has been published recently in the New England Journal of Medicine, are out at reception. So if you haven't got a copy, you can pick up a hard copy on the way out. And you'll see on here that the chief investigator of this trial, so our leader, is Professor Gavin Perkins from the University of Warwick. And there are a whole host of people, and you'll see what a sort of multidisciplinary team we are. There are paramedics, doctors, nurses, statisticians, methodologists, patients named as authors on our paper. We're funded by NIHR, and as Jonathan did at the beginning of Airways, we show the disclaimer. So these are the views of the authors and not necessarily those of the Department of Health and Social Care. The background you will know as experienced resuscitationists: cardiac arrest, a life-threatening emergency. Patient loses consciousness rapidly, and if we don't do anything about it, they're going to die. And there are about 30,000 people treated UK-wide for out-of-hospital cardiac arrests each year. There are about 60,000 out-of-hospital cardiac arrests by definition, but as we discussed when Jerry was here, about half of those do not have resuscitation started or continued on the arrival of the ambulance service for a whole host of reasons. It's a very time-dependent condition. Every minute reduces the chance of survival by about 10%. And bottom line, in the United Kingdom, fewer than 1 in 10 patients survive to go home. The chain of survival, you know, and you've seen various versions of the chain of survival. Adrenaline is, I wouldn't say it's a treatment of last resort, but it does tend to be administered when other things haven't worked. And we've been giving it, as you know, for about half a century for the indication of cardiac arrest. We've only really had CPR for about 60 years. During that time, of course, we've been using it without any proper tests of whether it's helpful or harmful for our patients. It's been based on expert opinion and pathophysiological reasoning rather than good evidence. So we thought we'd better do a trial. And we started talking about this trial many years ago. This paper came out in 2009. We were already doing PARAMEDIC1, the mechanical chest compression trial that you'll remember. And just as that was sort of halfway through, we were thinking, what should we do next? And we started to think about where the big questions might be unanswered in resuscitation science. And of course, adrenaline, or epinephrine in American, has been challenged now for around a decade or more in terms of its evidence base. So is it a double-edged sword? And we can look at this recent systematic review meta-analysis. I'm going to press the right button to see the reported effects of adrenaline in almost exclusively observational studies, except for one randomized trial that showed that in terms of return of spontaneous circulation, adrenaline seemed to be helpful at restarting the heart, seemed to be neutral in terms of 1 month survival versus, when you compared it to placebo. But again, most of these, in fact, all of these here on this slide are observational studies with all the caveats and confounding that Jonathan mentioned in his talk this morning. And in terms of survival with good brain function, which is really what patients want, it's what I want, the balance of evidence as it was favoured not having adrenaline. And if you look at the numbers overall in this, again, mostly observational studies, a relatively small underpowered trial by Ian Jacobs and co in Australia, which unfortunately wasn't able to complete because of the politics of trying to randomise people to adrenaline versus placebo, and pressure from unions and government in Australia resulted in that trial stopping prematurely, so they couldn't answer the question. But you know, hundreds of thousands of patients have been studied in relation to this question, but no one to date had done a proper, adequately powered, randomised controlled trial to try and answer the question. Now, there are reasons suggested as to why adrenaline might be harmful, and harmful to the brain in particular, and that's really because whilst adrenaline might be useful for so-called macro blood flow, it's not thought to be terribly good for microvascular blood flow. And you'll see this is a dog. Don't know the name, unfortunately, but you'll see this is and these were. There is a sort of silly film, but I'm not showing it here today. But you know, shortly after the administration of adrenaline, in the adrenaline arm, you'll see that there's restricted flow compared to the placebo arm at the same point in time after adrenaline administration. So there's something happening in the brain that seems to be associated with adrenaline. It's a bit more complicated than that, and you'll be pleased to know I'm not going to go into this. But you know, it might be the vascular effects of adrenaline, the microvascular effects. It might be something about the brain being uniquely sensitive to ischemia compared to other major organs, and we don't really know. And nor did the guideline writers. So this is the ILCOR. We heard about ILCOR from Jerry. This is the ILCOR statement in 2010 that suggested that we don't know. No placebo-controlled study shows routine use of any vasopressor, for that matter, during human cardiac arrest increases survival, and that there's a knowledge gap and we need trials. So we thought we'd do one, and it's called PARAMEDIC2. And when we started the trial, it was very controversial, as you know, with the media weren't terribly happy with us. There was a lot of support, however, from respected bodies such as the College of Paramedics, the Resuscitation Council, the British Heart Foundation, Intensive Care Foundation, College of Emergency Medicine, etc., just within the UK, and also internationally support, because this is an important question for public health, really. You know, there are hundreds of thousands of patients across Europe having a cardiac arrest every year, hundreds of thousands of patients in the United States, millions across the world. Quite a few of them get adrenaline, a treatment we don't know whether it's helpful or harmful. So there's a good justification for trying to answer this question. Because of the sensitivities of a randomized controlled trial in which an established treatment was going to be withheld from half the participants in the trial, we felt it was important to ask members of the public what they thought. And so there was a presentation of the evidence to several hundred members of the public, and they were subsequently surveyed, and nearly 9 out of 10 of them agreed that a trial was needed to answer this question. And 3/4 of the respondents said they'd be willing to be in the trial if they had a cardiac arrest. And importantly, 95% thought that long-term survival without brain damage was more important than survival alone or merely restarting the heart. And as you heard earlier, you know, we focused for decades on ROSC and survival to reach hospital and survival to leave hospital. The focus increasingly now is on the quality of the survival. And although it hasn't been mentioned yet, there is now a core outcome set for cardiac arrest, which has just been published by Gavin Perkins and team in the journal Circulation, which is a consensus that's involved a lot of public consultation around what outcomes we should be measuring in cardiac arrest. And that's freely available. I'd commend it to you. And needless to say, survival with good neurological function features very prominently in that. The sort of thing we should be measuring when we're assessing the quality of our systems of care. Now, there's an ethical obligation to provide the most effective care that results in the best possible outcome for the patients. And that was our starting point in discussions with the Ethics Committee. And we were able to argue that in this circumstance, a patient is unconscious rapidly. The attending clinicians have got to focus on doing stuff that's known to be effective to give the patient the best chance of survival. And in those circumstances, and we all know we've all been attempting to resuscitate people in and out of hospital, getting consent from that patient or from their representatives in the heat of that particular scenario is just impossible to do. So we had to consider how we balance the duty to provide effective treatments with a patient's right, or a person's right, to be involved in a research study that directly affects their care. You know, this isn't like going in for a randomised trial in hospital where you might have a discussion with your clinician in outpatients and be given information to take home and read and discuss with your family and then come back and consent or not. There's not time to do that. So we sought the views of patients and the public, of clinical colleagues, of the Ethics Committee and of the Health Research Authority to ensure that as we designed this trial, we complied with all the legal and regulatory frameworks. And this is the European Clinical Trial Directive 2001, which of course gave provision in about one sentence for the recruitment to trials without consent in certain circumstances, and that was translated into European law, into UK law in about, England and Wales law in about 2006 through the Clinical Trials Medicines for Human Use Amendment, which made it lawful to recruit a patient to a clinical trial in certain circumstances, such as those of cardiac arrest, where action is required immediately, that the patient doesn't have capacity, there isn't time to seek a relative or someone else's consent on behalf of the patient. So that's the argument we put for a so-called waiver of consent, and we were given a favourable ethical opinion by the Oxford Research Ethics Committee. One of the provisos from NIHR, the funder, and from the Ethics Committee, of course, was that we let the public know what we were up to. So we had, and several colleagues here were involved in ambulance services involved in this trial, that we put a lot of effort into going out to local CCG patient groups. Helen and I did a few, and to other patient fora and public fora to discuss the trial, to let people know what we were trying to achieve here. We also then distributed thousands of these leaflets, which you'll have seen not just in emergency department waiting rooms, but also in primary care settings, in public libraries, in post offices, etc., etc. We did everything we could to make the public, not patients, the public, aware of this trial in the areas that were undertaking the trials, so the trusts that you saw listed earlier. And we borrowed a strategy taken from North America, which was to offer a no-trial bracelet to a member of the public who did not want to be recruited to this trial in the event that they had a cardiac arrest. So we weren't asking patients, we were asking the public. And several hundred members of the public did indeed contact the trial coordinating centre to request one of these. And our paramedics who were recruiting patients to the trial were trained to look for the bracelet. And if there was a no-study bracelet, then those patients weren't recruited into the trial. But we also had a responsibility to ensure that if the patient regained capacity, those patients who survived, or their next of kin were informed as soon as possible about the trial and sought their consent to continue with data collection and follow-up. We had a big debate about what we do if the patient in the trial had died. Should we be writing to the next of kin to tell them they'd been in the trial? And the Ethics Committee agreed that that wasn't something we would be doing. But with the publicity given to the trial, it did mean that anyone was able to contact the trial coordinating centre to ask. And we had a process in place to to respond to that. We didn't have these provisions in place for the PARAMEDIC trial, which was a device trial, because, as with airways, it came under a different set of regulations. So because we're studying a medicine, this comes under a whole different set of regulations. So we had to put many more things in place than we had in the previous studies we've undertaken. Okay, onto the trial itself. So the primary objective was to determine clinical effectiveness of adrenaline in out-of-hospital cardiac arrest in relation to 30-day survival. Now, when we designed the trial, of course, that was before the period in which the neurological outcomes became more prominent as potential primary outcomes for trials of this nature. But we did include as a secondary objective the effects of adrenaline on survival, cognitive and neurological outcomes, and cost effectiveness of this treatment. I'm not going to present all of those outcomes to you now, though. Inclusion and exclusion criteria, out-of-hospital cardiac arrest in those patients who had ALS initiated by a participating ambulance service. An exclusion, known or apparent pregnancy, because this is a medicines trial, known or apparently aged under 16 for the same reason. Cardiac arrest caused by anaphylaxis or life-threatening asthma. There are no trials of adrenaline in those conditions, but it was felt that we should just avoid those patients. And adrenaline, standard adrenaline given prior to arrival of the trial paramedic. And we had those sort of things emphasised on labels on the study packs, which I'll show you in a minute. You know the algorithm well. You know that in shockable rhythms, adrenaline appears quite a way down the list of things that have to happen. So it's number 14 of 16. It's given a bit earlier, as you might see in the algorithm for the non-shockable rhythms. And what we asked and trained our participating paramedics to do was to open the box. So we had these bespoke medicines boxes for the trial, which contained either 10 syringes of standard adrenaline or 10 syringes of placebo, but they were labelled trial, so you wouldn't know. So this was at the point of delivery, the point of administration, the clinician was blinded to what they were giving. And we excluded, because occasionally these things happen, we excluded patients after randomization for the reasons that are shown there. And I'll show you a flow chart in a minute that gives more details of that. The outcomes, as I've just described, the primary outcome being 30-day survival, and we got our statisticians to tell us the sample size that we needed to recruit to answer that question. What did we find? Well, the average age of the patients in this trial was 69, and I can't remember in Airways 2, but I think the profile is very similar. 65% of our patients were male, and 6 out of 10, so 60% received bystander CPR, which is about the same again in Airways. That's encouraging. We could always do better, but that's encouraging many more than it would have been a few years ago. 50% of our patients had a bystander witnessed arrest, and of the others, 10% were witnessed by the attending ambulance crew. 20% initially in a shockable rhythm, and as we expect with cardiac arrest, about 90% had a medical cause of cardiac arrest, and the vast majority of those were a cardiac medical cause. So this is the consort, this is the standard way, you're familiar with it now. There's a test at the end for reporting randomized controlled trials, and I'll break this down for you. So we assessed 10,500 patients for eligibility and excluded 2,500 of those at that point for the reasons you can see, because of exclusion criteria: age, suspected pregnancy, had ROSC, had anaphylaxis or life-threatening asthma, or had adrenaline. And in London, because of the local protocols in London, excluded trauma. We agreed that as part of the protocol. So we had, of the 10,500 assessed, about 8,000 in the trial. Randomization was the pack is opened for this patient. Therefore, that patient's in the trial, and they'll be analysed whether or not they receive what's in the box. Now, after randomization, 87 were excluded because it was, the reality of resuscitation. So you're there, you're doing stuff, you're getting on with it, and then someone comes along and says they've got a DNA CPR. So you respect that. So they stopped. More information comes to light about patients' prior conditions. Some people develop ROSC, which is good, and so on and so on. So we had 8,016 in the trial who had the pack open and the contents of the pack administered. Of those, when we came to follow-up, and remember in clinical trials, you have to account for every patient. 8,000 had a pack opened. 2, we lost the pack number. We ended up with nearly 4,000 having placebo and just over 4,000 receiving adrenaline. We had to call it epinephrine for the New England Journal because it's an American thing. And you'll see we lost a very small number of patients to follow-up. Very small, which I think, given how difficult it is, that's pretty impressive. And that's not anything to do with me. That's to do with the trial team and particularly the paramedics and the paramedic researchers and the research teams in the participating trusts. So of 3,999 who had the placebo, we were able to analyse 3,995. Of 4,015 who had adrenaline, we were able to analyse 4,012. Pretty impressive, I think. So what did we find? Now, some of you will know this already. If you're remotely on Twitter, Twitter seems to be full of airways and PARAMEDIC2. In terms of ROSC, you'll see that quite a few more patients in the adrenaline group had return of spontaneous circulation compared to placebo. That's consistent with the data I showed you right at the beginning. Adrenaline seems to be quite good at restarting the heart. In terms of admission to hospital, so that means, obviously, if your resuscitation is terminated on scene because you haven't got a ROSC on scene and you're able to use the criteria to stop, then you don't take the patient to hospital. But you were more likely to go to hospital, significantly more likely to go to hospital if you'd had adrenaline. And you'll see there we do actually have some statistics, and that's significant. Survival to 30 days was higher in the adrenaline group. Again, that was statistically significant. But in terms of favourable neurological outcome, remember all the things we've discussed earlier about that, there was no difference, no statistically significant difference. Because there's some other concept in here that you'll see if you read our paper, which is about minimally clinically important difference. That's different to statistical significance. So it's not just about the numbers. And there's a less than 1% difference in that anyway. But when we looked at neurological outcomes, there was a different story. We used the modified Rankin scale, which you've heard about. And if you'd had adrenaline, you were significantly more likely to have a poor neurological outcome than if you'd had placebo, which became the headline in the newspapers when we published this trial. And we've tried to find ways of communicating what that means using infographics such as this one. And this is the modified Rankin scale. And we've not got death on there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 here. Okay. But you'll see of survivors, remember we started with 8,000 odd patients. Of survivors at hospital discharge, the adrenaline group, there were 126, and the placebo group, there were 90, that there were a lot more people who survived in the adrenaline group who had severe disability and actually moderate severe disability, which became quite a talking point. And we did some subgroup analysis which we'd planned, and they're in our statistical analysis plan. And really across all the things you might say, well, what about if it's witness? What about if There's bystander CPR. What about if it's a non-medical cause, age, all the rest of it? There really wasn't really a difference. You see, most of these are touching the line of unity, so-called, which means there isn't a difference. Some of them aren't. But overall, the picture is it didn't seem to make any difference whether you had adrenaline or placebo. And we did some comparative effectiveness work, and we looked at things like the number needed to treat and how we would describe how much more effective the different bits of the chain of survival are compared to adrenaline. So defibrillation is 20 times more effective than adrenaline in terms of survival. Bystander CPR is 8 times more effective, and that early call for help is 10 times more effective. So that might, in our trial, reshape Charles Deakin's new chain of survival diagram, certainly in the context of giving adrenaline. So we concluded adrenaline can restart the heart, and we saw that. You'll see that with ROSC, but it's no good for the brain. And putting that in scientific terms, I'll read out what our conclusion was to the paper. In adults with out-of-hospital cardiac arrest, epinephrine resulted in a significantly higher rate of 30-day survival than use of placebo, but there was no significant difference and no significant between-group difference in the rate of favourable neurological outcome, because more survivors in the adrenaline group had severe neurological impairment. I'll come back to what that might mean under the Q&A. As Jonathan said at the beginning, undertaking a major trial requires a cast of thousands, I like to say, and this is just some of the people that we can identify and thank for their involvement in the trial from the point of view of the participating ambulance services. But of course, we could have a list of the thousands of ambulance paramedics who had to be trained in the trial procedures and recruit patients to this trial. So this is a major undertaking, and it wouldn't have happened without all the people named on here and all the others that are unnamed, because there are thousands of them. So I'll say thank you to them there. Now, subsequent to that, ILCOR have put out statements about what they think of the results, and they've said they welcome it, and they will evaluate the results and determine if the current recommendations for use of epinephrine during CPR should be modified. And they say they'll do that in a timely manner and rapidly disseminate any new treatment recommendations. So I don't know what the timescale for that is, and I meant to prompt Jerry on that when he was giving his talk. But clearly we have the findings. We need to work out what that means for our communities in different parts of the world and what we're going to do with those findings. The European Resuscitation Council said essentially the same thing, as did the ambulance service medical directors in this country. But in the interim, key message for this audience, the view of NASMED, is in the interim, NHS ambulance service conditions will continue to follow established practice. So it's a key message, and we say this across medicine actually. Just because a paper's come out doesn't mean you change your practice the next day, because the dust needs to settle. People need to consider the evidence in the context of all the science in relation to that research question, and consider, and as we're going to do now with this trial's results, consult with the public about what they really want from resuscitation. And in different countries around the world and in different regions of the world, of course, there will be different societal expectations of an attempted resuscitation. So in some societies, it might be life is precious at all costs. In other societies, it might be actually, having more neurologically impaired, severely brain damaged people as a result of resuscitation means that resuscitation probably isn't the thing, isn't worth doing. Who knows? Who knows? There's a whole debate about to start on this, and ILCOR will lead that debate. And I'm sure there'll be more going on about that in relation to the values and preferences, not just of the guideline writers, but in terms of the communities we're trying to serve. And I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. That's really very thought-provoking. I'm going to just abuse the chair's privilege. So if you had a cardiac arrest tomorrow and you're 21 minutes into the cardiac arrest and a paramedic has arrived and has cannulated you, would you like the paramedic to give you adrenaline? Hands up if you'd like adrenaline in your cardiac arrest tomorrow. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Who would like no adrenaline? Okay, that's interesting. Right. So let's take questions from the audience. Richard. Might come in to your left.
Hi, Tom. Thanks
Hi.
for that. I just had a query about whether you'd done any assessment, whether the paramedics who took part in the trial were completely blinded to the intervention. I appreciate the boxes, they wouldn't have known what they were given, but I wonder once they'd administered them, whether they actually did have an inkling based on the physiological response from the patient.
I don't know, actually. It's an interesting question, isn't it? Because, of course, they've delivered the intervention. Because once you've well, there's two things here. Once you've opened the pack, the patient's in the trial, and we'll do that analysis under intention to treat. But in terms of the per protocol, so if people actually get the active ingredient, as soon as that goes in, it's in, and who knows? I mean, I don't think the way that these syringes were presented, it would be possible to tell the difference. And there are other reasons why you might regain a spontaneous circulation. The quality of CPR might pink you up. You know, there's a whole range of things. So I don't know, but it's a fascinating question.
Any paramedics in the room who took part in paramedic? Could you tell?
I've just been doing some...
Hang on, can you get a mic here? Thank you. Sorry, could you just introduce yourself for the audience, please?
Sorry, Helen Pocock, South Central Ambulance Service. So I've been doing some focus groups with the paramedics that took part in the study, and one of the messages I'm getting from there is that there was an assumption that if they suddenly achieved a PEA or a ROSC, that was adrenaline. Now, we've got no way of knowing because we're not unblinded to what the patients actually got, but amongst the paramedics there was an assumption. So they thought they knew what they were giving, but we don't actually know whether they were correct in that assumption.
And in a sense, did it matter? Because they'd already administered the intervention.
It wouldn't matter. So, so under the principle of intention to treat, once the pack is opened, the patient's in the trial and you can't take them back out again. That's the power of the whole process. So actually not being blinded post randomisation and administration wouldn't actually influence the outcome of the study.
Because, and remember, those paramedics are not going to do anything different as a result of that. And so anything else they do, you know, they're not going to be responsible for decisions subsequently, and they're not going to be the people assessing the patient's outcome. So there are all sorts of safeguards along the way throughout the conduct of the trial. I should say, when I was a coronary care nurse, when we were doing thrombolysis trials, gosh, that's ages me, you could tell when you reconstituted. If something was frothy, it was the active, and you know, so you could tell. But actually, the preparations we used for this trial, you wouldn't have been able to do that. So you're right. Maybe the patient's response. We should look at that. But it doesn't make any difference to the integrity of the trial.
No, the trial results are reliable. Any next question? One over there. Yeah, I'll take that one. And then we'll take this question here, and then to the back there where you are, Michelle. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Hannah Stevens, Education Training Officer for East. Was the patient downtime taken into consideration with regard to the administration of either the adrenaline or the placebo in the outcome of the patient with regard to neurological function?
Yes, I showed you a forest plot with a sort of subgroup analysis, and that some of those things will have been in there. But you're right, and I haven't said it probably out loud, but Jonathan mentioned 21 minutes. So the average time to receiving the trial agent, whether that was adrenaline or placebo, was about 21 minutes from the call for help. And that's created a lot of debate. We just had the European Resuscitation Council Congress in Bologna last week, and there was quite a debate. I think Jonathan was there. I wasn't. I was following on Twitter about that. You know, is it we're giving it too late? Is it that we're giving the right dose? Is it that we're not giving continuous infusions? A whole range of other things in here that might be thing. But of course, 21 minutes downtime is before administration of anything is a long time to wait.
So that leads on to some interesting questions about cardiac arrest in general. So one of the things to bear in mind is that there is what's called a lead time bias in cardiac arrest. So the earlier you give a treatment, the more likely it is to apparently work, because the more likely the patient is to get better. So for each minute that goes by in a cardiac arrest, the chances of survival decline significantly. And so there's some quite elegant research that's been done which shows that placebo given earlier is more effective than placebo given late. And the reason for that is that you're more likely to get a return of spontaneous circulation early in a cardiac arrest. So all interventions given early look better than interventions given late. So certainly a lot of the discussion in Bologna last week was around the problem with this trial is that adrenaline needs to be given earlier. Now, from a UK perspective, that's when adrenaline is given. And trying to give it earlier would have a significant risk of not doing the other things that work well. So the risk would be that everybody would be rushing to give adrenaline early and then we wouldn't be defibrillating the patient. That would be disastrous. So that's the reality of the practice that we have. Yeah. There are a lot of people, though, who don't like the result much and would like adrenaline to be more effective and wonder whether giving it earlier would be helpful. And that's possible, but not the way that the world works, certainly in this country. I think a lot of the question is around whether the kind of brain is salvageable at that point, or whether it's just gone, whether the fact that the adrenaline is being given at 20 minutes means that by that point, the vast majority of patients have irretrievable brain damage. It's not true for all of them, obviously, because some people do survive, but the majority of patients have irretrievable brain damage, and therefore there's nothing that we can do at that point. And the adrenaline might restart the heart, but the brain is irretrievably damaged, or whether the brain is actually salvageable. And if we restart the heart and find something that will protect the brain, that we can then get more patients through that process. And certainly the Americans, I think, are thinking along the lines of, well, if adrenaline restarts the heart, then we just need to look after people better later in the process. So take them to a better hospital, do things like cooling or neuroprotection or something, and that might improve the outcomes. Now, clearly, you can't survive cardiac arrest without ROSC. Yeah. So it's a complicated area. But at the moment, the problem that we seem to have is that the risk is that what you do is you increase survival, but it comes at a cost. And that cost is significant neurological damage. And therefore it becomes, as Tom's alluded to, a sort of a societal question about what do people want as a society. And there isn't an answer to that question, not a right answer, but there's a question it's an answer we have to find by consensus. And the public have as much right to answer that question as anybody else. It's a difficult question to answer. I look forward to the economics that will support this. Yes,
as with any major trial, there'll be a whole series of subsequent papers, reports coming out, because we have other analyses to report, including health economics.
And it's worth bearing in mind that I suspect it'll be quite an expensive treatment in effect, because the things that really drive cost in cardiac arrest are intensive care stay and long-term care for people with disabilities. Yeah. And so it's likely that adrenaline will save lives, but it will be very expensive to save that life. And we might say that's fine, but of course the budget for care and health is only so big. It's a pie, and you can only cut it in so many ways. So if you cut it in a particular way, then you deprive other people of that budget. And so it's not free money. You've got to pay for that somehow. And so the health economics it's real. People don't like to talk about health economics, but it helps us to prioritise our decision making by putting a monetary value on things. Allows us to compare the benefits per pound for different treatments. And it may well be that the cost of adrenaline is quite high, and then that makes us decide whether we want that to buy that treatment or not, accepting that to buy it we'll have to not buy something else that people need. So there's a question at the back. I'm talking too much. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. Greg Whitley, I'm a paramedic from East Midlands. Just out of curiosity, really, your exclusion criteria was patients under 16. I just wondered how that decision was made, as opposed to under 18, for example, which you quite often see.
It was made in consultation with the MHRA, who are the drug regulators, and the ethics committee.
Thank you.
The MHRA are a formidable body. and it makes drug trials just that little more exciting. I try not to do them myself. The question over here? Yep. Just that's it. Thank you, Michelle.
Barry Murphy-Jones from London Ambulance Service. You touched on this briefly. Do you think some further work should be done or further analysis on whether it was a shockable or a non-shockable rhythm? And a second up to that is a possibility that we've made a worse neurological outcome for shockable rhythms based on what we found?
The answer is yes to the first bit of that question, and we don't know to the second bit until we've done the analysis. So yes, we are. It's one of the series of planned outputs subsequent to the main report will be things like presenting rhythm, things like time of administration, all the rest of it. So we're going into those things in considerably more detail. We'll be looking at a paper on quality of CPR, probably. We managed to capture decent quality of CPR data only for about 250 patients, I think, overall, or something like that. The chest compression fraction was about mid 75, 78% in both groups, which I think is pretty good CPR quality. But of course, that's only a small fraction of the total number of patients in the trial. And one of the dilemmas we have, and Jonathan probably found the same, is when you're presenting a paper to a major journal and it's reviewed by particularly our American colleagues, they are very keen on quality of CPR data. And we haven't, in our system, we don't have everybody monitoring, assessing, auditing quality of CPR in out-of-hospital cardiac arrest. That would cost us quite a bit of money. It would. Yes.
Margaret.
I'm Margaret Douglas. My husband, Keith, suffered an out-of-hospital cardiac arrest. I've got a couple of questions or things to say. Keith, I don't know if he would be here if he hadn't been given the adrenaline. He was given 4 shots of adrenaline. He had quite a long downtime. He had a GCS of 3. He does not have significant neurological impairment. And I think that is really important that people understand that. Would he be here? I don't know. I'm interested to hear what you say, that you felt the people who you could perhaps possibly recognise, who you felt had been given the adrenaline. I know that's just supposition, but that's the first thing. I think to write off people and not give them a chance of life. And I understand that these people with severe neurological impairment perhaps survive about 6 months. We're not talking huge, long-term, costly survival, and yet you are giving someone a chance. That's the first thing. The other thing is the public who were asked for their opinion. Did they want to survive with impairment or not? Did they understand that there are very much varied levels of impairment? And it's all very well to say, do you want to be impaired? And they imagine that they're in a persistent vegetative state. Do they understand that they might perhaps have to give up work, but they can still lead a pretty full life? I think it's a really big decision.
Thank you, and I think that's a fantastic contribution to this discussion, because it does bring it all back to reality, doesn't it, and real people. In terms of the public consultation that was done, yes, there was a lot of information given, a lot of discussion, but of course that's only a few hundred people as opposed to a much wider societal conversation we need to have about this. And I don't know the answer about the outcome if adrenaline hadn't been given, obviously on an individual basis, so I can't really comment on that. But I think what you've just said, is the sort of contribution to the debate we're going to need to have. We're going to need to have the debate, and we're going to need to have that sort of contribution. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you, Margaret. I mean, I think it's very important to listen to a wide range of views, and I'm very glad that you and Keith were able to come today. I think the reality, of course, is that researchers and often clinicians can think in populations, thousands of patients, but each one of those patients is an individual human being with a human story. And so maintaining that is very important.
And I've certainly had a friend who was a cardiac arrest survivor for 10 years now, who, when this was published and we were talking about it, said very similar sorts of things that you've just said, actually.
there any further questions from the audience? Just one there, thank you.
So you obviously looked at the fact that there was the vasopressors that...
sorry, I can't hear you.
Sorry, you were looking at adrenaline specifically for the vasopressor as the intervention. Has there been any consideration for any other drugs that may increase that macro the macro vaso instead of it decreasing the micro vaso sort of interaction?
There's a whole raft of research questions coming out of this study. So, are we using the right drug? Are we using it at the right dose? Are we giving it the right way? In the, there's all those things. There's the other bit about, are there alternatives that should be tested to compare to adrenaline? At the outset, and I didn't show the slide, but in our protocol paper, which is published in Resuscitation, you can see it. We did a public consultation. Sorry, we did a consultation with health professionals around whether we should be doing a trial in the first place, and whether that should be a placebo-controlled trial or a trial of a different dose or a trial of adrenaline versus a different vasopressor. So those things were all discussed, and we ended up with what we ended up with and what we were funded for, and the results I've just presented. But of course, the resuscitation science world, if you like, is looking, and I know in North America and Australia, people are thinking about doing just those sort of trials. So this is not the end of the story by any means, and that's science. So you present your findings, and someone else might be thinking, well, we'll do another trial then. We'll do another trial that compares the adrenaline to one of the other pressor agents, or we might do it for a different dose. And so those things, people are already brewing up to apply for funding to do those sort of things. We're not currently at the moment.
Resting. Thank you. We've got time for one more question. Anybody got one more question or comment from the audience? Last chance. Anything on the day? John Black. You need a microphone. Thank you. Thank you, Maddie.
Thanks, Jonathan. Thanks, Tom. Just a comment as a contributor to the study. I think one of the points that does require emphasis, and that I will certainly be reflecting on as we move forward, is the numbers of patients that we needed to be treated in order for us to get an improved survivor. And that figure was 125. Yeah. And that number is very significant in terms of balancing the risk versus the benefit. And I think that's probably one of the key points that we all perhaps ought to think on as we move forward.
Yes, and it's the sort of thing that NICE is designed and empowered to adjudicate on, if you like. So as the researchers doing the study, we won't be making the decisions about treatment recommendations. That's done at a different level. But I'm sure that sort of thing will be taken into account.
Yes, and I think we also need to, the longer term outcomes are important, as Margaret's alluded to. We need to see what's going on at 3 and 6 months as well, because I think that's important to put into the mix.
And that's definitely on our list of subsequent papers to come out of this trial.
Okay, thank you, Tom. Thank you.
Thanks.